Okay, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context to this before I start. As you know, some of you know, I was at the 2019, in November, the Girls AA Office in Kingsville, Ontario, wonderful Kingsville, Ontario, with our provincial interpreter, Mike McPhee. And as much as we focused on the IoTs, as we've talked about earlier, we found an enormous challenge with the officials and the crews in dealing with the last 2 minutes. So when I got back from offside, I decided to do a little investigation to see what material there was available for us with regards to the last 2 minutes. And unbeknownst, not surprisingly, it is all over the place. There is information about the last 2 minutes in a number of places, including the interpretations manual, the rules, as well as what's most recently been sent out about what we're supposed to be doing in terms of handling timeouts. So I put together this presentation. I've reviewed it with Tony, and hopefully you will find it informative, because I'll tell you right now, there are 9 elements that happen in the last 2 minutes that don't happen in the previous 30 minutes of a high school game. Yeah, so it took a little bit of time for me to put this together, so hopefully you enjoyed it. So as I said, in all FIBA games, from an officiating perspective, what happens from a procedures, rules, signals, and mechanics perspective in the last 2 minutes differs significantly from what happens in the previous minutes. And this is the same thing that goes through in overtime as well, okay? I would offer to you, as we get into higher profile games with the OBA games, as well as into the high school playoffs, pre-gaming the last 2 minutes is vitally as important as pre-gaming other elements that you may want to do. We want to make sure we have successful outcomes for our games, and as these games get very much tighter, the last 2 minutes become that much more important. So collectively, I'm going to try to get you to explore these 9 elements with me. Hopefully you can take these away. We'll post them up on Arbiter, and I think Peter McDonald's going to post it on Referee University as well, and it'll be there for you to look at, make you better officials and better crews. Okay, we all know that our table crews are a direct extension of ourselves, and I would offer to you, we have to do an extensive pregame with them, not only about the general game, but also the last 2 minutes. Not only prior to the game, but also as we approach the last 2 minutes. It is vitally, vitally important. And all elements of those table crews, specifically the game clock and the horn operator, for a better term, in terms of what they're going to do in terms of starting and stopping the clock, and specifically when substitutions are allowed. And we'll talk about those. The score, specifically the number of timeouts that are required in the last 2 minutes, and notifying the coaches if there is a loss of the timeout, specifically. And the shot clock operator, specifically as we're using pure FIBA rules, not the YA Brable or the kind of somewhat bastardized rules, but more so pure FIBA rules, in terms of if they're going to advance the ball to the front court, setting the shot clock to the proper number. We, as a crew, specifically we're talking about a 2-person crew here, must make sure that we are signaling to our partner that the last 2 minutes are coming up. Now, we typically don't signal this in any other quarter other than the last quarter or in the last 2 minutes of an overtime. We typically only signal what? The last shot in a quarter, or maybe the last minute. So it's important that we know we're going into the last 2 minutes as a crew. Timing, from a timing perspective, game clock, we have to know, and the game clock operator has to know when to stop the game clock, okay? And when to start it again. So, when the game clock indicates 2 minutes or less in the fourth quarter or overtime, and a goal is made, as soon as the live ball enters through the basket from above, immediately after it passes entirely through the basket, the game clock is to stop. That means we've got to get our hand up immediately as soon as the ball goes through the hoop. Right? And we have to instruct the table accordingly to do that as well. Substitutions. we have to be aware, and the table has to be aware, if there are substitutions waiting at the table in the last 2 minutes. Specifically, the responsibility of that game clock and horn operator in terms of indicating that there are subs and waiting to be substituted in. Okay? And we as a crew have to be aware if there are subs waiting at the table and knowing if they are allowed to be substituted in depending on who's scored upon. Right? And who were the scoring team. So we know kind of the rules there, right? Fouls. This is probably the biggest piece of the last 2 minutes that we need to be very cognizant and aware of. Specifically as it relates to throw-ins. Prior to or after the ball's at the disposal of the player throwing the ball in. What's the issue here? What happens? It is a technical foul if what? If what happens? If what? If the defender crosses the boundary line illegally. Any part, leg, arm, body, any part, not just hands. After the ball has been released by the player throwing the ball in, what can happen from a foul's perspective? You could have a common foul, you could have a unsporting foul, or you could have a disqualifying foul. We'll talk about those in a second too.
So George?
Yes.
Sorry, so what happens if you're in a small gym and there's like no room on the end line? What can we do to prevent that crossing over the boundary line?
So what do we do in smaller gyms where there is less than 3 feet on the end lines or sidelines? What do we ask the defender to do? We ask them to step back at least 3 feet, a meter, and indicate that line, right? And I'll talk about that in a second, about the verbal warnings and preventive officiating we need to do to make sure that they don't cross that line. You all know what the criteria for unsporting fouls are? C1 through C5? No? Yes? So question is, which of these criteria, C1 through C5, are the most likely to occur in the last 2 minutes? C5? What else? C1? We'll talk about that in a second. Technical fouls. I called my first technical foul the other day after giving a formal warning. The player reached across the boundary line. Didn't touch the ball. Reached across the boundary line and hit the ball as the ball was being released. C5, most likely, contact by the defensive player on an opponent on the playing court during the last 2 minutes in the last quarter or in each overtime when the ball is out of bounds for a throw-in and still in the hands of the official or at the disposal of the player taking the throw-in. C5, most likely. Then, C1, not a legitimate attempt to make a play in the ball within the spirit and intent of the rules. How often do we see a player grabbing the other player's body or arm, trying to take a foul? Come on, guys, ladies.
All the time.
All the time. Even not in the last 2 minutes, we need to be making this call. An excessive hard contact caused by a player in an effort to play the ball, make a play on the ball on the opponent. So in other words, making a hard swipe at the ball but having excessive contact. These are probably the most likely scenarios. And then there's C3 and C5, which tend to be more transitional ones we probably may or may not see in the last 2 minutes. Okay? Okay, we talked about this, but I'll just quickly review it. Again, in the last 2 minutes, the ball is out of bounds for a throw-in still in the hands of the official or already at the disposal of the player taking the throw-in. If at this moment a defensive player in the playing court causes illegal contact on the player with an offensive team, it is an unsportsmanlike foul. We must make the call, folks. Don't simply call it a personal foul. Okay? These are the learnings from, as I said, from the offsite that I just attended, because some of the crews did portions of these things I talked about well, but some of them didn't. Timeouts. How many are allowed within the last 2 minutes of the game?
2 per team.
2 per team. What happens if there's 3? What is our responsibility, you think, as a crew, both table and officiating crew, to do with the coaches?
First stoppage after the 2 minutes, let them know.
To inform the coach what? They have lost one of their timeouts because
We're in the last 2 minutes.
we're in the last 2 minutes. Right? It's part of a preventive officiating we need to do. Because I've seen at offset where the coaches have said, I still have 3 timeouts, and they don't know the rule. They don't know the rule. Okay?
Right.
Okay, we'll talk about a little bit about the decision to advance the ball and specifically the changes that came into play this year. This is the new procedure for the last 2 minutes. It is exhaustive, tiring. You wonder why we're even doing it. And I would suggest Mike McPhee would say, we're probably going to see a change to this, but for now, this is what we have to do. This is a 2-person mechanic procedure. Okay? Following a timeout taken by the team that is entitled to the possession of the ball from its backcourt, and they have the opportunity to advance. Prior to the 50-second time elapsing, each of the officials is to position themselves where? In front of the benches, huddles, and at the 50-second horn, they are both to blow their whistles. What's that indicating to the teams?
You have 10 seconds.
We're going to go, their timeout is ending. They are to get the ball back in play. The crew chief then asks who?
Head coach.
The head coach that requested the timeout, whether or not they want the ball where? Either in the back court or the front court. Then, he or she steps in front of the table, blows their whistle again, and indicates where the ball is going to be put into play. All the while, the crew chief has the ball in their hands. In the last 2 minutes, we do not put the ball on the floor when a timeout's requested when we're potentially advancing the ball. Just another thing we got to keep in mind. The crew chief, or the referee in this case, has to have the ball in hand. Good job, George. Okay? And the crew chief, FIBA wants the crew chief or the referee always to administer the throw-in. They want the referee to be in the active action area. Okay? And in the note at the bottom, the procedure is in getting a clear and timely decision on the throw-in location is primary. We want to know where the ball is being thrown in. Secondary to the administration of the throw-in itself. Okay. Scenario. Timeout's been called within the last 2 minutes, and say in the backcourt or after they've been scored upon. You now are following the procedure, and the coach has said to you, I want the ball in the front court. You haven't even asked them yet. What's the decision the coach has made?
You have to go with that one.
Yeah, exactly. You have to go with the decision that's been made. Irrespective of whether or not you've asked them or not, after a coach has made his or her decision, it is a final and irreversible decision, regardless of whether or not you've asked them. But once you've asked, once they've told you, that's what it is. If there is subsequent activity, the other team takes a timeout, or there's some other action that happens, it doesn't change that decision. Okay? Now I see this time and time again. Where do we throw the ball in the front court if we're advancing? Folks, please. Opposite the table where? Just outside the three-point line. The FIBA three-point line. Not the high school three-point line. Not at half court. Okay? So we got to kind of figure out where that 3-point line is roughly, and that's where we throw the ball in. Okay? Important where we throw the ball in. Now, most coaches will not ask where the ball will be thrown in, but we have to indicate you're going to have the ball in your hand. It's not on the floor. Right? If it's in the backcourt where they call the timeout, the ball still may be on the floor, depending on what you've decided to do. Okay. There are some very unique signals and mechanics and procedures that happen. We talked about the timeout specifically on all throw-ins. We talked about it. I also want to make sure that you pregame all last shot responsibilities and bench decorum. We don't talk about it, FIBA doesn't talk about it, but it's vitally important. Far too often, crews have not understood where the game clock is located on the wall, and thus who may or may not have last shot responsibility or game clock responsibility. So in the gym when we were in Kingsville, they happened to be on one wall on the end line, and depending on who had the ball, either the trail had last shot responsibility or the lead had it. Can you imagine what would happen in the last 2 minutes? When you had to stop the game clock and you have to have both shot clock and game clock responsibility. And there is pressure. Everyone is standing. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so, like it or not, every time we throw the ball in, or the ball is being thrown in without us handling the ball, what must we do? Yeah. As silly as that may sound, we are responsible to give the illegal boundary crossing signal warning on every throw-in. Okay? If then the defensive player moves any part of his or her body across the boundary line, a technical foul shall be called without further warning. Okay? And as I said before, the same procedure shall be applied after all successful field goals and last free throws, irrespective of when we are handling the ball or not. Now, I would suggest to you, I'll use Tony's common sense, if there is no pressure, you may get away with not having to do it. But if there is any pressure, a basket has been made, you are in the lead position, you are 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet from that player, not 50 feet, but 20 feet from that player, you still have to do this. Why? Because if you don't do it, what is the ramifications? You didn't give the warning. Okay, also in this lot of scenario, after the ball is in the left hands of the player taking the throw in, a defensive player in order to stop or not to restart the game clock causes illegal contact with an offensive player who is just about to receive or has received the ball on the playing court. We talked about this earlier. If such contact is a legitimate attempt to directly play the ball, the contact shall be immediately called as a personal foul. If there is hard contact, then it can be either an unsportsmanlike foul or a disqualifying foul. How many people have actually called a disqualifying foul? Yeah, one. Few of them, yeah. Okay, my advice, having done this for many decades, it is in your best interest, that of the coaches and players, to do a number of preventive officiating things, specifically as it relates to unsportsmanlike fouls. Knowing that teams may and will purposefully foul, especially if the game is close, in advance, prior to that, just prior to the last 2 minutes or just within the last 2 minutes, I would give a large, loud verbal warning indicating to all players that to make a legal play on the ball or else it is a unsportsmanlike foul. You don't have to give it to each team. Once you give it once, I think, and if you do it loud enough, you'll know that you've given that message in. Likewise, on technical fouls, on throw-ins, same thing. You only need to do this once. On the first opportunity. Make sure everyone hears you. Okay? I use the word loud, and I mean loud. Not to move any part of their body across the boundary line, whether or not that's that 3-foot line or the normal line. Okay? I'll tell you right now, many of the coaches don't know this rule. They don't. Okay, in summary, 9 elements. Do a pregame, folks. If you are doing a high-profile game, I don't care what level it is, and it is likely to be close, and the last 2 minutes are going to be an important factor, you are to pregame it, please, and make sure that it happens. I know at OFSA, the first couple of rounds were 52-12, 70-14, but as we got into the quarters and semis and finals, all the games were very close. And I would suggest to you, as we get into the boys season here into February, into the OBAs, this will become an important factor. So pregame, please. Both separately the last 2 minutes and your regular pregame. Spend the time with your table crew in advance. Pregame with them. Talk about these elements with them, with the scorer, with the timer and the horn operator and the shot clock operator, as well as do it prior to the last 2 minutes of the quarter as well. Remind them yet again. They are an extension of us, and being prepared and aware is important. Visually indicate to your partner within the last 2 minutes or coming up to the last 2 minutes. Timeouts, be completely cognizant and aware of how many are remaining and whether there's going to be a loss of a timeout, and inform the coach appropriately. Are they entitled to advance the ball or not, depending on the situation of where the ball has gone out of bounds? Okay? And the procedure to advance. And whether or not the shot clock has to be reset. Table crews and coaches, because we have in Wairabo the opportunity for coaches to call live ball timeouts, so I put it in small font, but dead ball timeouts, right? The requests for timeouts, obviously Norma and FIBA go through the table and making sure that the table is fully aware of how many timeouts are remaining. The game and shot clock operators, setting, stopping, and starting the clocks properly, both the game clocks and the shot clocks. And sounding the horn appropriately for both substitutions if they're waiting to be substituted in after a made basket, as well as during timeouts. Okay? Substitutes. Are there any waiting at the table? We have to be cognizant of where, if there are players waiting at the table to be substituted, and which team scored. And if the game clock operator or horn operator doesn't blow the horn, it is our responsibility to blow our whistles and making sure that they're substituted in. If they substitute, so the team that was scored upon substitutes one person, the other team can substitute all. Throw-ins. In all situations, as I mentioned before, you must in the backcourt, then use proper judgment, but in all other cases, you must do it. Okay? And fouls. Well, we talked about those technical fouls and then sporting fouls, specifically to those situations, illegally crossing the boundaries after the warning signal, and unsporting fouls, and technical fouls as it relates to those activities. Okay? And teams attempting to foul. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Sorry, in the brevity, sorry, brother. We're running late. Any questions, please get them directed to George. We'll,
That's a good one.
yeah, I know it is. However, we're running late. Any questions, either ask George after or send him a quick email, and